Today at the National Rural Press Club, Australia's Agriculture and Emergency Management Minister Murray Watt. Just months into his role, Senator Watts had to deal with devastating floods and the increased threat of livestock disease outbreaks. Here's Agriculture and Emergency Management Minister Murray Watt at today's Press Club.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club of Australia to this Westpac address. My name is Lucy Barber. I'm the National Regional Affairs Reporter for the ABC and I'm also the President of the National Rural Press Club. Our guest today is the Honourable Murray Watt, the Agriculture Minister, the Fisheries Minister and the Forestry Minister, so quite a lot, but you're also the Minister for Emergency Management. And his address, as I mentioned, is going to be to the National Rural Press Club, and we're very grateful to the NPC for hosting us here today. Mr Watt will be announcing Australia's first ever national biosecurity strategy. And of course, as many of you in this room will know, that could not be more relevant at the moment, given that livestock diseases such as foot and mouth and lumpy skin are on our doorstep. It's estimated an FMD outbreak could cost the Australian economy around $80 billion. Meanwhile, the destructive varroa mite has already made its way here. It's hard to remember a time when biosecurity was such a hot topic. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Murray Watt.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I've heard that bell be rung many times watching National Press Club addresses, but I don't think I've ever been in the room for one, let alone giving one. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you also to Morris and everyone from the National Rural Press Club for hosting today's event. It's a great delight to be here so early in my term. I acknowledge that we come together today in the nation's meeting place, Canberra, and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri custodians who for thousands of years have cared for country, tended our waters and harnessed its produce. I also acknowledge, before I forget my wife, Cynthia, I didn't have you on the acknowledgements list. Very bad mistake. It's fantastic to have you with me on this next step in our journey. Can I also acknowledge Lucy again and all of the media partners who are here, the sponsors for today, the Indonesian ambassador, His Excellency Dr. Siswo Pramono, and other ambassadors who are with us today. My parliamentary colleagues and good friends, Senators Jenny McAllister, Tim Ayres, Raf Ciccone, Alicia Payne, Dave Smith, and I even saw Senator David Pocock up the back there, who we Origin match the other day. Can I also acknowledge ACT Agriculture Minister, Rebecca Vassarotti. It's great to have you here, Rebecca. And of course, former Labor Agriculture Ministers, John Kerrin and Joel Fitzgibbon. It's great to have both of you here. The President of the National Farmers Federation, Fiona Simpson, the President of the ACTU, Michelle O'Neill, industry, union and community leaders, and all of us who have an interest in the future of Australian agriculture. As we sit here in Canberra today, the judging of the dairy cattle competition is underway in my hometown of Brisbane at the Ekka, the Royal Queensland Show. The Ekka, if you haven't been to it before, is where the country meets the city, where the city learns about the country, where families from across our state are reunited. The Ekka truly does bring people and agriculture together. Growing up in suburban Brisbane, I remember heading to the Ekka with my own family, heading straight for the main arena to see the cattle judging, the show jumping, the horticulture displays, and of course, the woodshop. I'd listen to my parents' stories of growing up on the land as we headed in. Mum's family, trying their hand on dairy farms on the Darling Downs when her father was out of work in the city. Dad milking cows before dawn on his family's dairy farm near Mackay, then riding his horse through flooded creeks to his tiny school, and returning home again to milk at the end of the day. His stories about having to walk off the farm with his family after trouble with drought and banks, before cutting cane and picking fruit in Victoria in the off-season. For a city kid like me, These experiences and conversations opened my eyes to a different world. Now, I've said before already in this role, I'm not a farmer and I'm not going to pretend to be one. I think Australians have had enough of politicians faking it. But I do think that my family's farming history has helped me appreciate the highs and lows of farm life and why it matters so much to have a government that stands with the industry in good times and in bad. It's why, as a Senator for Queensland, I've spent so much of the last 6 years in our regions and across our north, making connections that, as it turns out, have been very important to have made. And it's why I was so excited when the Prime Minister asked me to be Australia's new Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and of course, our new Minister for Emergency Management. When my dad left school, aged 14, to work on the family farm, he would never have thought that his son would be up here one day, talking about the future of the industry he and my mum grew up in. And it's an honour that I will never take for granted. I was back at the Ekka on the weekend, talking with farmers, hearing their stories, learning how domestic and world events impact on their prices. And it's truly inspiring to see firsthand the passion that rural Australians have for their animals, for their produce and their profession. And I believe that the millions of Australians who live in the cities and suburbs around the country share that inspiration. Every day, we are thankful to the farmer who puts food on our plate. When we savour that fresh piece of snapper or barramundi, we are thankful to those who harvest it. And, as my wife well knows, as one of Australia's many home renovators, we are very thankful for the millers who produce our timber. We are thankful for the pre-dawn starts, the countless hours of hard labour, the care for our land and waters, and the sacrifices made to ensure farm products are world-class. Now, the old saying goes, without trucks, Australia stops, and that is true. But it's also true that without farms, Australia starves. This connection that I'm talking about between city and country, producers and consumers, will guide me in this important role going forward. I consider myself very lucky to become Australia's Agriculture Minister at what is, overall, a pretty good time for the sector. In most of the country, we've emerged from drought, commodity prices are high, trade is more diversified. In fact, ABARES forecasts the gross value of Australia's agriculture, fisheries and forestry production will exceed $86 billion this year, the second highest on record. Our agricultural exports are forecast to be the highest ever, at nearly $65 billion. And we're expecting a 2.6% increase in the value of fisheries exports. Forestry products are expected to grow even further, with a 5% increase to the industry value to $2.9 billion. Now, collectively, these forecasts indicate that we are heading ever closer to the industry goal of a $100 billion agricultural sector by 2030, as set out in the NFF's roadmap. So I feel incredibly positive about the future of the industries that I now have the privilege to represent in Cabinet. And I'm not alone. The latest Westpac Agribusiness Intergenerational Farming Report, that's quite a mouthful, finds that 80% of older farmers and 74% of younger farmers are optimistic about the future of their farms. Now, of course, not all is rosy. High input costs mean that many farmers are experiencing a profitless boom. Years of workforce shortages affect all industries across every part of my portfolio. Ongoing trade issues have impacted wine, barley, lobster and other products. Floods have wiped out crops in several regions, causing huge farm losses and price rises at the checkout. But these challenges should not blind us to the significant opportunities that exist for the agriculture sector. New products, new markets, new avenues for value adding, and more sustainable practices. Now, this government and I as Minister are determined to take these opportunities and challenges by the scruff of the neck, to work with all stakeholders for the betterment of our country. It really is time to turn the page for agriculture. We need to have relationships that are built on honesty and respect. We need a government that charts a path for industry success, not one that sets up roadblocks to avoid. In taking this path, I will draw on the tradition of past Labor agriculture ministers, inspiring figures who reformed the sector to face the challenges of their times. All farmers understand the concept of succession planning, a sometimes difficult process to choose the right person to inherit the farm. And now, within Labor, a similar responsibility has been passed to me. For some in the room today, all the way back to William Scully, a former Labor agriculture minister who saved wheat farmers during World War II. But the person who does keep returning to my mind, and he's already been acknowledged, is Bob Hawke's Agriculture Minister, John Kerrin, who I'm really pleased could be with us here today. As many of you would know, John was the Minister for Primary Industries for more than 8 years. And in my view, he was easily the most reformist agriculture minister in Australia's history. And his ideas have already helped to inform my thinking. Those early morning and late night emails don't go unread, John. As for me, built on a career as an advocate and a policymaker, I come with my own experiences and my own views. And I come as someone who listens and collaborates, which I will now draw on as together we take this important sector to new heights. So having told you probably a bit too much about who I am, I'd like to outline the what and the how. What are Labor's priorities in the agriculture portfolio? And also the how. How will we approach those priorities? And how does that differ from what's come before? But first, the what, and right now, there's no bigger topic than biosecurity, as you were saying, Lucy. Now, biosecurity has been front of mind for a lot of Australians in recent weeks and months, especially since foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease reached Indonesia earlier this year. And that focus was sharpened when foot and mouth spread to Bali, a mere month after I became minister. Quite an introduction. This whole episode has brought the state of our biosecurity system into sharp relief. I personally think of our biosecurity system as a wall, one that's been built up over decades to protect our agriculture industry. Now, the wall is still strong, and in fact, it's one of the best in the world, and we should all be very proud about that. But the reality is that decisions of the previous government have weakened that wall. Short-term thinking, a failure to fully implement the Crake Review and Inspector General reports, the botched biosecurity levy, to name a few. All of these things created cracks in our biosecurity wall. And now it's my job to repair that wall and make it even stronger. So that's why I've begun work to deliver something industry has called for many years: long-term, sustainable biosecurity funding. Something that was not delivered by the previous government, but which we committed to in the last election. Now, this will take a little bit of time, and it will certainly take a lot of discussion with our Expenditure Review Committee. But fulfilling this commitment is integral to the security and growth of our farm sector. In the meantime, we have faced the immediate challenge of foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. Our three-pronged approach has been swift and strong, but also measured and consultative. Firstly, we got to work instantly to provide help to our neighbours in Indonesia. Ambassador Pramono, it was a great honour to travel to your country as my first overseas visit as Minister, to see firsthand the response from your government in combating the spread of foot and mouth disease, and to open the door for us to keep working together to fight it. Already, Australia has provided expert veterinary assistance to Indonesia, along with over 430,000 vaccines for lumpy skin, to be followed soon by 1 million vaccines for foot and mouth disease. Because the best way to stop FMD reaching Australia is to stop its spread through Indonesia. And that's why I'm pleased to announce today that the Albanese government will provide an additional $10 million in biosecurity funding to Indonesia. And I thank my colleague Senator Wong for her assistance in this important announcement as well. This package will provide more urgently needed vaccines and technical support. And it reflects Australia's commitment to leverage our healthy partnership in support of Indonesian efforts to address this challenge. It's in our national interest to offer support to our neighbours when it's needed. Beyond our support for Indonesia, we've also ramped up our own protection measures at our borders, with more biosecurity officers, detector dogs, sanitisation foot mats at airports, biosecurity response zones, 100% screening of mail from Indonesia and China, and 100% risk profiling of returning passengers from Indonesia. As I've said, this is the strongest biosecurity response in our nation's history, more than any government has ever done before. Thirdly, we are also improving our readiness should an outbreak occur here. Last week, we created a new exotic animal diseases preparedness task force to ensure that Australia is better prepared in the event of a foot and mouth or lumpy skin disease outbreak. The task force brings together our experts in biosecurity and animal health, along with our experts in disaster management. It's what good governments do: plan for the best, but prepare for the worst. It's what I've done in disaster management around the floods, and it's what I'm doing here as well. We don't need to wait for events to happen and then scramble to respond. That's something we've seen all too often in recent years, and we can do better. And today I build on this, as Lucy said, by releasing Australia's first ever National Biosecurity Strategy. This strategy, for the first time, outlines the key actions for all Australians to ensure a stronger biosecurity system. The strategy provides clear direction to ensure our biosecurity system remains fit to meet the challenges of the next decade and beyond. I'm really pleased that a new spirit of cooperation between federal, state and territory agriculture ministers, along with industry, has seen it finalised as an early priority of our new government. From the start, we have worked hand in hand with industry, as well as states and territories, to ensure we get our response to the latest biosecurity threats right. And I sincerely thank all in industry who are here today for their partnership in meeting this challenge. It's forged very positive relationships that I think will stand us in good stead as we deal with a range of other issues. As a result of all of our collective hard work, it's important to remember Australia remains foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease free. It's an important point to make here today, and one we should all project to our trade partners overseas. Unfortunately, we have seen some irresponsible fear-mongering from some quarters, which has only caused concern from our trading partners and cost our hard
government's specific agriculture visa. You know, many farmers are concerned that the decision to implement an ag visa under the Pacific scheme won't be enough to plug those critical shortages. Are you open to extending the visa requirements to other countries if there were, say, willing workers in Southeast Asian nations?
Yep. Thanks, Jess. Well, I suppose the first point to note is that there are already a range of visa arrangements that farmers can make use of to bring people in from overseas if needed. I'm aware that there are different views about how successful and workable they are. We have already said that we will honour the MOU with Vietnam as to the ag visa because that MOU was concluded by the time of the election, but it's not our intention to carry that through with any of the other countries where negotiations were still underway. My sense from speaking to farmers is that there were many who had hope for the ag visa, but what I sense is that people just want workers, and they're open to different arrangements and schemes that can deliver the workers that they need. And as I say, I don't think we should give up on the idea of employing Australians in agriculture. I mean, the vast majority of people who work in agriculture are Australian citizens. And with the right training, there are some opportunities there. But of course, we will always require a level of migration to support our agricultural workforce. What's important, I think, is to put in place systems that work for farmers but also respect people's protections. And I think that the PALM scheme that we're talking about will make a big dent in the needs of farm workers. And as I said, I'm open to discussing with industry, unions and others whether there are other arrangements that are needed as well. There's no doubt, I mean, when I first took on the portfolio, workforce shortages was the issue that everyone was talking about with me. It's sort of been overtaken by foot and mouth disease in the last few weeks. But I know that the ag workforce issues haven't gone away, and we've got to be open-minded about how we deal with it.
I guess 5 or 10 years down the track, and maybe the NFF is suggesting that farmers do still need a specific visa that is not related to anything else, and say Australians aren't taking up the work in great swathes that you would hope, would you be open to looking at, an agriculture-specific visa with another country?
We don't consider that that is necessary. I'm happy to have those discussions with farm groups. We don't consider that it's necessary to have a separate visa just for agriculture. We think that putting in place the right frameworks around our existing visa system is a way that we can obtain the overseas workers that are needed. I mean, as I say, there was a lot of talk about the ag visa, especially from the former government. It didn't deliver a single worker for all the time that it had been talked about, whereas with the PALM scheme, we've got over 40,000 Pacific workers who are vetted and ready to come here at the drop of a hat. So I don't know why we wouldn't make use of that workforce to begin with. I've heard some views about whether there might be other people needed with different sets of skills. Happy to look at that. But the PALM scheme, we think, as I say, will make a big dent, and of course it'll provide a very big diplomatic benefits to us in the Pacific as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Josh Butler from The Guardian.
Thanks, Minister, for your speech. To ask a question with your emergency management hat on, if I could. You spoke a lot about...
My emergency management staff will be very happy. I'm just going to refill water while you're talking.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, you spoke about the climate effects on agriculture. Could I ask your thinking on how that feeds into your work on emergency management, disaster planning, that sort of thing? Specifically, if you could talk about the spending and planning on the Disaster Ready Fund, where is that at? What projects will be first off the rank? And secondly, could I ask your thinking on a suggestion from Brendan O'Connor before the election about less reliance on the Defence Force in emergency situations like that, and the standing up of a potential civilian national disaster response agency?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, obviously in the lead up to the election, I in particular and the now government as a whole talked a lot about the need to be better prepared for the natural disasters that we know are coming and are going to be coming in more frequency and more severity. And investing properly in disaster mitigation is a really key part of that. I think we spoke about there's too many ERFs, the Emergency Response Fund, as opposed to the Emissions Reduction Fund. The Emergency Response Fund and how that had done nothing in 3 years. So that's why we decided to devote that funding to a new Disaster Ready Fund, which will invest up to $200 million a year in disaster mitigation. Something the Productivity Commission had called for several years before. So we have begun work to make the legislative amendments that are required to set up that fund. It will require a small number of amendments to begin with, and I'd hope to be able to introduce them pretty soon. We have already started talking with states and territories about the types of projects that they think might be needed, and local government's very interested in this as well. Obviously, the former government had finally dedicated some of that fund towards post-disaster resilience work, particularly in the Northern Rivers region, and we intend to honour that. So again, we're working with, it wasn't just Northern Rivers, Queensland and New South Wales after the floods, so we're working with those states to identify how that money could be spent. But we do want to have that long-term fund that we can start using for disaster mitigation to reduce the damage for people, their homes, the taxpayer, every time we have a disaster. The second part of your question...
Civilian Defence Force. Oh, the
Yeah,
Civilian
the
Response
Defence
Agency,
Force.
sorry.
So, again, I've had some preliminary conversations with Richard Marles, obviously now the Defence Minister, about that. And I want to be careful what I say here because we are in no way downplaying the importance of the role the ADF play in disaster recovery. They do incredible work. They have incredible skills and equipment that aren't necessarily around elsewhere. And having been in disaster zones when the troops roll through, you can't underestimate the morale boost that gives to a community. So we think that there will always be a role for the Defence Force, but we do have concerns about how far they are being stretched. And their core job is the defence of the nation, and we do need to make sure that we're not stretching them so far that can't remain their core focus. So that's why we are looking at some non-defence mechanisms for recovery work. We made an election commitment to fund Disaster Relief Australia, which is essentially a veterans organisation that gets veterans out to help with clean-up from disasters, and we'd be keen to look at further things like that. Minderoo is doing some good work in the post-disaster recovery space, so it's sort of about supplementing that disaster workforce because, unfortunately, we're probably going to need to do it a lot more.
So would there be some sort of, I guess, separate national state emergency service or something along those sort of lines, or would it be that formal, do you think?
I don't really envisage us setting up what would it be, FES, Federal Emergency Service. I mean, we do need to recognise that the primary responsibility for disaster management rests with the states and territories, supplemented by a local government. But we are certainly open to funding organisations that can help, particularly with that clean-up and reconstruction work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Kath Sullivan from the ABC and also the Rural Press Club.
And also next to Lucy's desk. Minister, thank you for your address.
Most important title.
Exactly. If I could put two quick questions to you. Before the election, Labor, apart from axing the ag visa and ending the live sheep trade, didn't really have many agricultural policies. But the main one, I guess, was to end the live sheep trade, and that was announced by an animal rights group. It was leaked through an animal rights group. You talked about wanting to be collaborative and less divisive in this portfolio. Was that move divisive or collaborative? And can we expect more of that kind of thing? And if I could follow Mike's lead and point to Tanya Plibersek's press club address the other day, I just wondered if she's sought your counsel about the possibility of the Commonwealth re-entering the water market and whether you would support the Commonwealth buying water entitlements from farmers.
Thanks, Kath. So, to deal with water first, I'll be honest, I haven't discussed water matters in great detail with Tanya up until now. We've both been working on a few other things, but clearly it's an issue that impacts on the portfolio. We remain committed to our election commitment, about 450 gigalitres. Of course, we've only recently learned with the release of the water account, the special account, how little the former government had done. So that task is going to be harder than what we had originally thought, but we remain committed to it. In terms of live sheep, I think it was unfortunate that that policy was essentially announced by an activist group or not by anyone other than the opposition at the time. I would have felt the same if it was announced by an industry group. I don't think that's anyone's fault, but I think it was unfortunate that that happened. You will have seen that I made it a very early priority to go over to Perth expressly to talk with sheep farmers, meat processors, export firms about the policy. And I've been very straight with people to say that I intend to carry out the commitment. We made a commitment to phase out the export of live sheep. That's largely based on our view that, unfortunately for the industry, it has lost its social licence because of past events, but that we want to do that phase out, again, in a collaborative way, in an orderly way. The Prime Minister made clear that it's not going to be done just in this term, so there's time to get it right. That will have impacts on some firms and some regions, and we want to work with them about that. So I think I've certainly, since I've been in the role, in terms of implementing the commitment, I've tried to be as collaborative as I can.
Okay, but don't expect any more policies from third parties.
That would not be my intention, especially now we're the government.
Next up, we've got Jamison Murphy from The Land and the Rural Press Club.
G'day, Minister. Thanks for your speech. It's been 2 years since the federal court ruled the 2011 Gillard government ban on live cattle trade was illegal, yet the federal government is yet to settle the class action and compensate those affected. The class action is over $600 million and it's accumulating interest at a rate of about $1 million a week, which taxpayers will have to pay eventually. Many of the small businesses in that class action are in Northern Australia and they've been really affected by what's happening with foot and mouth. There's been a big drop in the industry there. And this compensation would really tie them over the next few months. When can they expect that compensation?
Thanks, Jamison. And I should have declared I'm a former class action lawyer, including in the agriculture space. So I followed that case with interest. I wasn't involved in that one. This is something that I have discussed with my department. And what I'm advised is that there are pretty active discussions underway between the parties and with insurers. This will involve insurers in terms of paying those, whatever settlement is reached. I think that people understand that we do need to finalise this as quickly as we can, but we're talking about large amounts of money and we need to do it properly. So I would be hopeful that, I can't give you a time frame exactly, but I'd be hopeful that we can reach a conclusion in that as soon as possible.
Krishani Danji from SBS.
Krishani Danji from SBS News. Thank you for your address. I was wondering, you mentioned earlier there are 40,000 workers in the PALM scheme that are ready to go. Can you provide more of a timeline as to when they will be arriving and how much you think they will provide support for farms?
Again, I can't give you an exact time frame, but again, I've had discussions with Pat Conroy, the Minister for International Development in the Pacific, about this, and I know that Penny Wong and her office are pretty engaged on it as well. We recognise that there is a critical shortage of agriculture workers at the moment in the country, and so the sooner we can have people in, the better. Obviously, there are already Pacific workers here, but there are many more who could be brought here to assist. We made commitments around the payment of airfares and a range of other measures to make it more attractive for people to come here and work as well, which we are going to be putting in place. So I'm pretty confident that it's a high priority for the ministers who have direct responsibility for it. Sorry, the second part of your question, what kind of work would they be able to do?
Or just how much of the gap do you think that they'll be able to fill?
Well, look, I don't know that anyone has quantified the exact shortage of agricultural workers. I know that it's very big. And probably is more than the 40,000 who are available. And that's why I say I'm happy to talk about other options, while noting that there are also existing visa programs that can be used. It may be that between me and industry we can do a better job of making farmers aware of those options. But as I say, if there are improvements that can be made to make those options work better, then I'm open to them as well. The principle is let's get workers on board, whether that, preferably from Australia, if not from overseas, make sure they're treated well and their rights are respected.
Thank you.
Next up, we've got Simon Gross from Canberra IQ. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. You used the metaphor for our biosecurity defence of a wall. It's solid, but there's probably a need for it to be a bit more responsive than a wall. Going to FMD, it became an issue in Australia because of barley. But it had been in Indonesia for some time before then. And I understand there's evidence that it got to Indonesia from Thailand. I also understand that FMD hasn't yet got to PNG or Timor, and I figure there's informal contact between parts of Indonesia and those countries. So what can you tell us about the defences we have against FMD and other diseases from countries other than Indonesia?
No, good question, Simon. Most of the focus I've found in this debate has been on FMD and has been on Indonesia for understandable reasons. But you're right, particularly if we're talking about lumpy skin, if it were to get into Timor-Leste or PNG, that would be a bigger risk, just given their closer proximity to Australia. Some of the funding that we've already announced, while it was pretty much badged and reported as being for Indonesia. It also included support for Timor-Leste and PNG, and we would intend to ensure that some of the extra support that we're providing found its way there as well, because we're acutely aware that were those diseases to get into countries even closer to Australia with existing travel and trade relationships, that would be a big problem as well. I think you can understand why Indonesia's been the highest priority for the moment. And it's encouraging to see the reports that are coming out of Indonesia as to how they're managing that outbreak. But we certainly have not lost sight of those other countries. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that our Deputy Chief Vet or one of our other senior people has either been into those countries recently or is about to go. So we certainly are maintaining contact and thinking about what more we can do to help.
Thank you.
Keep building that wall.
I need a flexible wall by the sound of it.
Andrew Tillett from the Australian Financial
I can't tell you why Liverpool drew 2-2 and didn't win. It pains me as well.
So, long season, 37 games to go. Thanks, Lucy. Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and board member here at the Press Club. Minister, when China began its campaign of economic coercion of Australia a couple of years ago, primary industry producers were the ones that bore the brunt of it. We obviously saw tariffs put on barley and wine, but there are other industries affected by sort of effectively de facto bans: timber, cotton, seafood, etc. I was just wondering, in the improvements that we've seen on the surface, at least in the bilateral relationship with Beijing, whether we've started to see some of those commodities moving back into China, or if you think that that's probably not going to happen. Some have already started to diversify. Is the idea of getting back into China perhaps gone for those industries?
Thanks, Andrew. I don't think it's necessarily gone forever, and I think we need to remember that despite some of the trade disruptions we've had with China, it remains not only our biggest trading partner, but our biggest agricultural export market. So there are many commodities that are still being exported into China as we speak. But I think also, while the picture overall might not be too bad, we need to recognise that there are particular commodities that have suffered and particular regions where those commodities are very important to their local economies. So, you would have heard both the PM and the Foreign Minister say it's in both Australia and China's interests for our relationship to stabilise. We don't intend to back off in protecting our national interest and standing up for our values. But of course, we would welcome a stabilisation of that relationship, and we would welcome China lifting some of the trade barriers or bans that it's put in place. I haven't got any evidence in front of me to suggest that that has changed. As far as I'm aware, the barriers and bans that have been in place remain in place, but we would be hopeful that would change before too long. The second part of your question...
Well, I think that you've pretty well answered it.
So, diversification. But in parallel, we are keen to support more trade diversification, and some of the stuff that we're seeing and hearing there is really encouraging. I know Vietnam, as one example, there's a lot of interest amongst our producers in Vietnam. There's a range of other countries as well, and I think all Australians have learnt a bit of a lesson that it's helpful to spread your eggs across a few baskets, whether it be in agriculture, education, tourism, other industries as well.
Vaccines. Thank you.
And the Chinese ambassador will be appearing at the National Press Club tomorrow at 12:30.
See what he has to
more
say.
on that then. Tim Shaw, Board of Directors of the National Press Club.
Minister, thanks so much for your speech. You've given us the what and you've given us the how, but importantly you mentioned First Nation voices. You've also spoken about the success, members of the NFF, certainly the union movement, expansion of the industry. More than 200 years ago, Indigenous men and women cared for the land, and now the federal government is talking about a voice in the Constitution. Can you give us the how you and the stakeholders, your department, particularly with agriculture, can deal with some of the challenges facing Indigenous custodians, particularly, say, the South Coast, abalone farmers that are overfishing? How are you going to bring those voices together? Do you need to wait for constitutional reform to do that? And should there be Indigenous voices heard at the Jobs Summit to expand the number of Indigenous men and women working in Australian agriculture?
Thanks, Tim. I haven't seen the full invitation list to the Jobs and Skills Summit, but I'd be pretty surprised if there weren't representatives of First Nations people as part of that discussion. Sure. And I don't think we have to wait until a voice to Parliament is hopefully established to involve Indigenous voices. The very first roundtable I organised as the new minister with a cross-section of people with an interest in agriculture, of course included many representatives from industry, but it also had representatives from First Nations communities, it had union representatives, it had conservation voices as an early demonstration that what I was going to be about and this government is about widening the voices, as I said in the speech. I know that I don't know a lot about the abalone issue. I know a little bit about the abalone issue, and there's probably many other examples right around the country. And I think the only way to empower First Nations people and assist them take full economic advantage of the assets that they own is by having them at the table. That's what the Voice to Parliament's all about. It's about giving people a voice, giving them a say on things that directly affect them. So I certainly intend to keep involving Indigenous representatives in any roundtables or discussions I have.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Katie McLeod from NCA Newswire.
Hi, Senator. Katie McLeod from the NCA Newswire. Thanks very much for your address. Given that you've spoken a lot about the agricultural workforce shortage, I'd like to ask you what your position would be on an amnesty for undocumented horticulture workers. And following on from that, the union movement has called for a royal commission into exploitation in the sector in the past. Would you support that, and do you think it's still needed given that now legally farms are required to pay an award minimum rate?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Katie. I'm going to leave the undocumented arrivals to my ministerial colleagues who have responsibility for migration matters to respond to. In terms of the Royal Commission, I have to say no representative of a union has raised that with me since I've taken on the job. So I guess from that I take it that doesn't remain a massive priority. I'm happy to be informed otherwise. My sense is that all Australians, including unions, are keen to see some of the measures that we already announced at the election implemented, whether that be national labour hire licensing schemes, some of the other migrant workforce exploitation issues that we made commitments around. So it would be my intention to work with my ministerial colleagues to deliver on some of those improvements in consultation with unions and industry, rather than setting up a Royal Commission.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Minister, I had one final question. You touched in your speech on our ability as a country to feed ourselves, but what role or how important do you think it is for Australia to help feed other nations? And in particular, what's your view on the role of food security for our trading partners, especially in the context of our global diplomacy efforts?
Yeah, I guess I don't see it as one or the other. Of course, we would want to ensure that we have enough food to feed ourselves both now and in the future. But we are a trading nation. Most of our agricultural produce is exported, and depending on the industry. So I think that we can do both. When I was in Indonesia, the agriculture minister that I met with raised food security as a very big priority for their government, and it's the same for many other countries in our region. So I do think that there is a really big role that we can play in assisting our neighbours with food security.
Does it need to be bigger?
That role? Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, I feel pretty positive about the state of the sector going forward, and as long as we can keep growing it, then there's enough to go around. I think it's really helpful for our diplomatic relationship in our region, Asia Pacific, to play that kind of role. I think it wins you points with your neighbours, and you would have already seen our government putting a lot of effort in that regard. So food security can certainly play a role there too.
Murray Watt, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Lucy.
And as a little token of our appreciation, we have a fabulous membership card to the National Press Club,
beauty.
which I understand gives you free car park rights.
How about that?
What more could you want? Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Murray Watt.
Lucy.
Thank you.
Thanks,
There you go.
Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for coming today. We really appreciate your time, for giving up your time. And just once again, please thank the Agriculture Minister, Murray Watt.